We're live. And it is now recorded.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our June 12th webinar, Managing Your Valuable Curb Space, presented by Mallory Baker. Looks like we've got participants still adding, so if it's okay with everybody, I'm just going to give it a second or two to catch up a little bit. Is that all right, Mallory?
Yeah, that sounds great.
So while we're waiting for everybody to kind of catch up and come on in, I would like to remind everyone or put it out there that if anyone attended the panel discussion that we had with one of the other parking organizations, was well attended and had some great information. We're doing another webinar on July 8th, another panel discussion on what recovery is going to look like. We kind of waited a little bit, mostly because people are still in the process of reopening. We're not 100% sure what it's going to look like or what impacts are going to be. So that'll be a panel discussion on July 8th, webinar on recovery. It'll be fun. So we've got quite a few people, and it's not increasing in participants like it was. So what I'm going to do is introduce Mallory Baker with Walker Consultants. Mallory has worked with Walker for 4 years. She formerly worked in staff augmentation and development for cities and towns throughout the Mountain West. She focuses her consulting practice at Walker on creating effective public engagement strategies that support and direct implementation and effectively navigating conflict in the face of transformational change. We all need the information on that right about now. So Mallory, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that introduction, Darby, and thank you everyone who has joined us today for this webinar on managing your valuable curb space. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you to SWAPTA for having us today. So let's get started. On today's agenda, we're going to touch on the basics, so talk a little bit about what curb management is and what we can achieve with curb management. We'll talk about specific tools for success for different modes of travel, and also our implementation methods for making sure that those modes of travel are effectively accommodated and you can actually start to implement curb management in your municipality or your campus context. We'll talk a little bit about best practices and approaches from municipalities and in different campus environments throughout the region. We will be talking a little bit about COVID-19, shocker, navigating our new normal, as we're calling it, these unprecedented times, et cetera, how you can actually create a curb that effectively adheres to our new safety guidelines and social guidelines. And then we'll touch on a couple key contacts and open it up to questions and answers. If you do have questions throughout the presentation, there is a question and answer box in your little Zoom toolkit, or you can get in touch with us over chat. We really are hoping to have an interactive discussion here today, so please feel free to chime in, and we will hope for a lively discussion when we're wrapped up. So what is curb management? You know, the curb and the right-of-way have traditionally been seen as a vehicle-centric environment with not a lot of order. This image is intended to represent kind of the disorder and confusion that typically happens in a curb environment that's not managed effectively. So curb management is really the intentional order of the curb and the right-of-way to accommodate different modes of travel. And especially in an environment where those modes of travel are changing practically on a daily or weekly basis, it's really essential to do this in any context. Historically, as I mentioned, you know, the curb has been seen and the right-of-way has been seen as a vehicle-centric place. You know, you travel down the street and then you pull over at the curb in your single occupancy vehicle. But now the curb is really a place where a ton of different modes and a ton of different activities are happening on a regular basis. So you really need to create order and flexibility in your curb and your right-of-way to ensure that those different modes are being accommodated, and you can even anticipate new modes. So that's things like transportation network companies, which are new over the last decade, taxis, transit, bicycles, even dockless scooters and bikes in some environments, deliveries, which are becoming more and more prevalent, especially in today's context. And also the curb and the right-of-way are seen as a gathering space, as a place where you can maybe do business or greet a friend. So this is a hugely important space for both municipalities and campus contexts. So why do curb management? What can we achieve here? Well, we can really start to make access more equitable among different modes of travel. You know, historically, this curb has been seen as a primary space for vehicles and for travelers, but we really need to start thinking about how we can create order and access for all the modes that people are using to get around, and even people who aren't using the curb to travel, but rather to conduct business or perform another activity. We can improve level of service for multiple modes by creating order and organization at the curb and in the right-of-way. We can also collect data on how people are using our right-of-way and our curb so we can make better decisions. And finally, we can monetize the curb. In so many cities and in so many campus environments, the curb is really the most valuable piece of real estate that we have. And so monetizing the curb, while that might not be the practice that you're ready for, it's really a great way to really realize the value of that important real estate. So tools for success and implementation. And as we're talking about these, I really want you to keep in mind that curb management has historically been understood as a really sexy, really techie topic in transportation and mobility planning. And we want to shift away from that and really talk about tactical urbanism and simple ways that you can actually achieve curb management no matter what stage you're in terms of your transportation mobility planning. Passenger pickup and drop off is obviously a massively important topic right now. It was in the past, but especially now that a lot of our parking areas and travel areas are now being converted to pick up and drop off, quick curbside space. It's especially important to monitor and designate those areas appropriately. So let's start really simple. You can designate these areas just using simple signage, simple A-frame signage, or curb markings, paint, really basic and cheap physical ways where you can allocate pickup and drop off areas along your curb or on your campus. When we're getting a little more advanced, you can start to use video data collection to monitor pickup and drop off areas, monitor dwell time, and really understand how people are using the pickup and drop off areas and make sure that they're being used appropriately by people who are actually performing pickup and drop off rather than vehicle storage. Geofencing, of course, easier said than done, because geofenced areas need to also, that data also needs to be pushed down to mobile applications, Google Maps, Apple Maps, Uber and Lyft applications that drivers use. But if you do want to use geofencing, simply it's a virtual geographical boundary within which pickups and drop-offs are permitted, or within which fees will be charged and regulated. And finally, on that note, monetizing passenger loading zones is a way that cities can actually start to, rather than losing revenue due to the permeation of Uber and Lyft and other TNC companies, can actually start to increase their revenue or at least make up the gap using monetization of those pickup and drop-off areas. So you can do that through a simple, meter system that you might already have in place, or you can actually use geofencing to monitor use of those loading zones and push down a fee automatically. Autonomous vehicles are always a very important topic to our clients. We are frequently asked about the impacts of autonomous vehicles, specifically on parking demand. And we like to come to the conversation with an objective and fairly conservative understanding of how autonomous vehicle permeation will impact parking demand. We still think that a lot of drivers will choose to use traditional vehicles over AV, and that in many environments, AV will take quite a long time to permeate. And you'll still need to have vehicle storage for those types of vehicles. So in dense urban areas with high parking costs particularly, we do anticipate that the permeation of autonomous vehicles will likely result in a reduction in on-street parking demand, and instead an increase in loading and unloading space at the curb. So if that spells you, if you're a dense urban area or a dense, campus environment, that makes it really important for you to start thinking about ways that you can achieve monetization and start gathering revenue through passenger pickup and drop off. Tools for success with the pedestrian realm, especially now, the curb is becoming a gathering space and really one of the only places where we can have social interaction. So a lot of communities are looking at, temporary parklets, even spaces outside of restaurants where people can gather, eat, and socialize. A simpler way of achieving an effective and attractive pedestrian realm is using things like curb extensions and sidewalk enhancements like street planting and landscaping to make sure that pedestrians feel comfortable in a space. And improving your pedestrian realm has really far-reaching impacts. It can have indirect economic benefits to your surrounding retail businesses and improve their walk-in levels. And it also can increase customers' interest and ability to park farther away from the business that they're intending to go to. Bicycle is obviously another important mode of travel. You can start really simple here with some simple paint markings on the street without any physical barriers between the bike lane and the travel way. A more advanced method, a protected bike lane, like as shown in the middle picture here, where you have the bike adjacent to the sidewalk and then parking in between the bike lane and the travel way to really protect those bikers from oncoming travel. And finally, you can even get into protected bike lanes and also signal timing specific to cyclists so that cyclists can effectively navigate through, for example, a busy urban street. Tools for success with transit are especially important if your city has chosen to prioritize modes of travel that move more people, have a higher output. So if you're trying to reduce single occupancy vehicle usage and prioritize public transit or modes of travel that move more people at the same time, then you might consider some curb management strategies that improve transit level of service and especially bus level of service. So those are things like queue jumps where a bus can evade the single occupancy vehicle travel lane and kind of scoop ahead of them. Bus bulbs, right turn pockets, transit only lanes or bus only lanes. And then finally, you're getting into even enforcement, automated enforcement, for example, of a bus lane to make sure that that lane is specifically dedicated for a bus travel. And you can do that during certain times. You could maybe turn it on during rush hour and turn it off during less congested periods of travel. Docked and dockless vehicles, a hugely important issue right now, especially for my municipal folks out here. So I've seen so many things with these scooters. I've seen a scooter literally floating in the Potomac River in DC. I've seen them littered on sidewalks. And really what that's telling us is there needs to be some sort of regulation around these e-bikes and e-scooters that are amazing tools for us to use for micromobility, but really need to be regulated in order to be effective. So this delineated parking areas can do a wide variety of things. First, they can make sure that your sidewalk is not cluttered in a way that prevents, folks with mobility challenges or mothers or fathers pushing strollers down the sidewalk. They have an unimpeded area to travel in. They can also enable communities to actually achieve what they want with scooters. So very frequently, scooters end up in environments that tend to be richer, whiter, and actually have more mobility access because they're used as recreational tools for people. So if you want them to be first and mile connections and actually decrease your mobility challenges for folks in areas of your campus or areas of your municipality that have trouble traveling and getting places, a delineated parking area can make sure that people are putting those scooters or those e-bikes back in places near transit stops or other locations where that first and last mile connection is needed. And finally, it can reduce the impact on your public work staff or whoever has been responsible for picking up these scooters and taking them to appropriate locations. And again, I want to emphasize that this can be done really simply. You don't even have to have a rack for these things. You can have some simple striping. Of course, you might want to monitor or enforce how they're being parked, but you can, in terms of physical markings and physical costs, you really don't need that much to make this effective. E-commerce and deliveries, you obviously don't want this hot mess that's happening in this picture here. A lot of communities already use designated loading zones using simple signage to make sure that deliveries are occurring in areas that are appropriate and maybe adjacent to kind of hot spots for deliveries. You might also put time restrictions in place so you can make sure that those loading zones are being used appropriately for deliveries and drop off rather than for vehicle storage. The key with time restrictions, you must enforce them, and it is really challenging to enforce 15-minute time limits. Of course, you're not going to conceivably have an enforcement officer stopping by every 15 minutes to make sure that no one is taking advantage, but you really do need to enforce regularly in order for those to be effective. Then you're getting into monetization. So you don't have to do geofencing to make this effective. You can go really simple and have maybe a permit system for frequent commercial delivery operators. You can use special meters, maybe colored meters, to effectively collect those fees in loading parking areas. And finally, you can get into demand-based pricing, meaning that you can structure your pricing and your fee structure for commercial deliveries such that it's higher, maybe in the early morning hours when a lot of deliveries are happening, and lower in less popular times of the day to conduct deliveries. Parking is still important. The space is really still used for single occupancy vehicle storage as well. So really creating ways where you can monitor that usage and make it work for your community or your campus context. So a lot of communities already use maybe residential or neighborhood parking permits in areas possibly adjacent to a downtown where there might be some spillover potential. So that's a way to monitor what user types you're prioritizing along your curb space. Parking time limits, hugely popular. Again, they do not work if you do not enforce them. Flexible curb lanes. So you might want to use signage or some other means of physical marking to maybe have a lane be parking for maybe off rush hour hours and then convert it to a travel way during rush hour to reduce congestion. Parking pricing, typically the first way that communities or campuses start to monetize their curb. Parking management and benefit districts are great to think about a shared option specifically for shared funding of operations and maintenance for a parking system. And finally, demand-based pricing, a hugely popular and common topic of conversation, especially among our municipal clients. A quick caveat, a lot of municipalities really want to do demand-based pricing, and a lot of consultants will tell you that it's possible and easily to implement. However, even really advanced big cities like San Francisco aren't able to use demand-based pricing in the precise way that they might have intended, meaning that they're adjusting pricing constantly to achieve a certain utilization level in their parking assets, on-street parking assets throughout the community. So we have seen communities effectively implement demand-based pricing when the price changing is a little less constant than that. And also it's more digestible for your users. Users really tend to get used to a certain pricing, and when they might not understand, it might not be easy for them to understand why it's changing. So if you can do seasonal pricing, if you can really communicate a simple fee structure where it's higher on maybe the weekends or on event days, that's a good level of demand-based pricing that we've seen be implemented. In an airport context, a lot of airports have been able to move their accommodation of certain travel modes like transportation network companies off street into maybe the ground floor or a certain floor of their parking structures. It's a great way to reprioritize and do sort of like a light adaptive reuse of parking structures, especially in environments where you're seeing a lot less parking demand and a lot more transportation network company usage. So I'll play this video kind of while we're talking here. Walker has looked at a lot of different systems for especially passenger pickup and drop off and how they can be accommodated on the ground. We've looked at maybe 6, 8, 10 different combinations and modeled them through this a program called called Vism. And what we've noted is that this kind of double stacked option is the best way for vehicles to move through the space without really backing things up and achieving effective flow through the system. We use, an understanding of dwell time and, how long people are taking to get their bags out of the car, kiss their, hopefully not their Uber driver goodbye, but maybe whoever's dropping them off, etc. Other tools for success, really focusing on the passenger environment, as well as the vehicle environment is really important. Making sure there's effective and large enough areas for passengers to congregate and wait for their ride. Making sure those loading zones and staging areas meet ADA requirements. Signage and wayfinding at key decision points for drivers, so making sure that people can navigate the airport effectively and know where they're supposed to go. And also using interior signage and wayfinding to accommodate and match what drivers are seeing on the outside. So as people are getting out of the plane, disembarking, moving to the pickup and drop off areas, they know where they're supposed to where they're supposed to go, what floor they're supposed to be on, etc. So hospitals, the key here is really to use data collection to effectively track patient, non-patient pickups and drop-offs. Most of our hospital environments are using valet operations, making sure that that front entrance and that porte-cochere area is sized appropriately to meet the demand based on your data collection. Considering moving deliveries to the back of the house rather than the main entrance. I've been in a lot of hospital environments where deliveries are unregulated, and also making sure that the interior of the hospital is effectively laid out so that deliveries can be accepted in the back of the house rather than through the main entrance. And finally, managing front door pickup and drop off locations on Apple Maps, on Google Maps, on Uber and Lyft, etc. So if a patient is using a transportation network company or even their own GPS system to get to the hospital, they come to the right place. University environments, again, those designated pickup and drop off locations for transportation network companies and pushing those out to the mobile apps and the appropriate mapping systems is really important so that you don't have transportation network companies constantly circulating through your campus, which can be really dangerous and is definitely undesirable in an environment with a ton of pedestrian activity. And you know how kids are on their phones constantly when they're walking, so you don't want that. The other thing we've seen be effective on a university campus is partnerships with micromobility companies. So, a lot of riders of these new e-scooters, e-bikes, et cetera, tend to skew younger. Obviously on a university campus, you have a lot of younger folks who might be using these new modes of transportation. So really, instead of just letting the e-scooters and e-bikes come to your campus and sort of act unregulated, creating an RFP process, creating some sort of partnership with those companies to make sure that they're helping you as a campus achieve your goals as well. And you can regulate and use active enforcement as needed to monitor usage of those types of transportation modes. And finally, managing on-street parking. So making sure that if you have any public streets within your campus, you as a university are taking ownership of managing that on-street parking among your student or faculty population and coordinating with surrounding residential neighborhoods in your community so you can make sure that you're reducing the potential impacts of town gown challenges. And we've seen that be really effective in a lot of our municipal environments where there's a big university and a municipality that are having challenges, creating a partnership around that on-street parking has been really effective. So, starting to talk about implementation. Curb management is really best suited for areas where there's a ton of different modes of travel and activity converging, central business districts, downtowns, campus environments like we've talked about are great candidates for curb management. If you have a lot of, single family residential neighborhoods, or you're in a suburban context with like a lot of surface parking, big box stores, strip malls, that kind of thing, not really great candidates for curb management just because it won't give you as much bang for your buck. So where do you fall on the scale? We created this scale to really show you that curb management can be achieved in any context, no matter what stage you're in your journey. And it really is a journey. So when we think about curb management, we so frequently think about tech and monetization and things like that, but it really starts with just simple delineation of your right-of-way from privately owned land. So if you're on scale level 1, for instance, you might be starting some really simple curb management strategies, like simply physically delineating your right-of-way, installing curb, gutter, and sidewalks, educating your population around the purpose and the ownership of the right-of-way. And if you're at level 7, you might be, installing parklets, starting to monetize loading zones, things like that. So the path to success, it's so simple. All you have to do is these steps. I'm just kidding. We'll talk a little bit about what we think the steps are important to actually achieve implementable curb management. So the first step is really to evaluate existing conditions. What are the physical conditions? What's the parking demand? Doing a parking study, doing a study to look at transportation network company, pickups and drop-offs, passenger pickups and drop-offs, bicycle usage, who's using what modes and how frequently are they using them, what space is there to accommodate them, etc. Looking at the regulations, so looking at the existing ordinances on the books that dictate how the municipality can manage the curb, what rules are users supposed to follow. What are people's general behaviors? So if you don't have designated pickup and drop-off areas, for example, you can see kind of where people are doing that, how people are doing that, dwell time, that kind of thing. And also qualitative feedback. So talking to the users, seeing, is this hard for you? Is this easy for you? What are you doing? How are you experiencing the system? That can be really helpful. Technology can help. Those video data collection facilities, automated parking and guidance systems if you have them, ground-based sensors, although there aren't a ton of sensors on the market right now that effectively communicate data at this point, and also mobile applications all can help you in your quest. So really leveraging all the data that you have at your disposal to make these decisions. Engaging stakeholders and users, so starting to speak with people and establish mutual benefit around, we want to do this curb management initiative, how will it help our constituency, and really starting to tell that story. Also understanding what behaviors are and what you can do to adjust them. For example, in my neighborhood in Denver, we had a transition where we had originally the bike lane up against the travel lane, and then we had the parking lane abutting the sidewalk, and the city chose to switch the bike lane and the parking lane. So they now had the bike lane on the outside and the parking lane on the inside. And the city sort of just put it up, and it took a while to adjust behavior. So starting to understand, what people's current behaviors are and what it will take to make sure that people are adhering to the new normal. And finally, using pilot programs. So if you are piloting a new technology, for example, creating an opportunity for people to test out different options or try it out for a few days, really see and touch and use the new technology so that you can start to gather feedback and make changes as needed. Finally, establishing your priorities. So understanding primary users and activity types in the area you're working in. For example, if it's a central business district with a ton of office workers, you might prioritize commuters, you might prioritize vendors, deliveries, etc. And what are the communities or campuses goals for the curb and mobility generally? For example, if you're community really wants to reduce single occupancy vehicle usage, you might want to develop curb management initiatives that are prioritizing transit or some other mode of travel other than single occupancy vehicles. So a trade-off evaluation, you really want to look at when you're choosing an initiative or a strategy, what are the trade-offs, what are the benefits? So let's say your community is considering specific loading and unloading areas for commercial deliveries and TNCs. The benefits might be, you know, reduced double parking and safer unloading and loading. The trade-offs would be reduced on-street parking capacity, for example, or maybe a reduction in vehicle throughput in the travel way. So you need to weigh those, you know, with your community, with your decision makers, so that you can make a decision and actually understand ways where you can deal with those trade-offs if needed. A hospital context, you know, you're considering expanding front of house porte-cochere locations and increasing valet staffing. The benefits would be improved service for patients, like not as long lines at each valet station, but the trade-offs could be that the space currently allocated to commercial and medical pickup and delivery is now in a back of house location. So again, you might need to reconfigure your interior or place some administrative staff in those areas so deliveries can be accepted. In terms of static versus flexible treatments, you know, static treatment those are permanent changes, and really in those contexts, only one or two modes can be clearly prioritized and accommodated. But you know, they're longer lasting, they might be more effective in adjusting behaviors on a permanent basis. Flexible treatments, those are really important right now, especially in kind of the uncertainty that we're living in. Those are transient and flexible updates to improve access for multiple modes, kind of when and where they need them. Selecting treatments, again, when you finally select a treatment, you want to go back through all of the things that you just did. Your data collection results, your public feedback, what your trade-offs were, how you're dealing with those trade-offs, what your community or your campus context is prioritizing. And then you want to establish performance metrics. So how are you going to measure the effectiveness of this new strategy? If it's a bike lane, are you measuring it through you know, how many people are using it, or is it some sort of Vision Zero initiative where you're reducing pedestrian bicycle conflicts? You know, what does that look like, and how are you going to monitor it and look at your success? Regulations, insurance, and contracts, really important, especially when you're thinking about public-private partnerships, for example, those partnerships with scooter companies that we were talking about. So you really want to think about what your role as the campus or the municipality will be in that partnership, what regulations will be set forth for your operators, what about your riders and passengers, who is assuming liability for different types of incidents, how will you administer and administrate that contract, how often will it be renewed, what's the term, etc. And finally, privacy and data sharing. So is the city able to get data from that company on their users? How is data sharing occurring? Is the city obligated to share any data with the company itself? All of these things are things that you need to think about if you're embarking on this type of partnership. So best practices and approaches. Let's look at some communities and campuses that have been really successful in their curb management strategies. I wanted to bring up Eagle because it's a tiny little town. And it really is a small community that actually did some effective curb management. So what was happening in this community is it basically didn't really have any delineation between the public right-of-way and private land and private property. So what was happening was, because there was really no curb and gutter and sidewalk installed in a lot of, especially residential neighborhoods adjacent to its downtown, what was happening was residents were using that right-of-way for long-term storage of vehicles, RVs, boats, all kinds of things. So the town wasn't really able to effectively manage the right-of-way or conduct things that they needed to accomplish, from utilities, street sweeping, snow removal, et cetera, et cetera. So this community really just publicized existing ordinances on its books regarding vehicle storage in the right-of-way. It kind of did a little education with the community on what people could use the right-of-way for, why the right-of-way is public, and why it was important for the town and the community to have access to the right-of-way, and also just starting to enforce the ordinances that they already had on the book. So this is a really simple, elementary example of curb management, but still curb management. On the total other side of the spectrum is Chicago. So Chicago is obviously, you know, advanced in terms of monetization and curb management generally. The city is not only charging TNC fees within a geofenced area, but is also starting to tier its existing TNC fees to achieve goals that the city has around single occupancy vehicle usage and types of ridership. So it's charging certain fees to single occupancy users of Uber and lower or Lyft, and lower fees to users of Uber Pool or Lyft, you know, a pool option for those TNCs. So that's a way that Chicago is not only achieving monetization, but also using monetization in a way to prioritize certain types of riders. The University of Missouri was really successful. This is actually a project that my colleague, Chrissy Mancini-Nichols, worked on. She is the curb management strategy lead for our firm. She helped the university partner with the city of Columbia and Missouri to take control of this kind of e-scooter craze by developing an RFP that was specifically intended to make scooters a first and last mile connection and a mobility option for people who are having challenges getting to the campus or getting around the city, rather than a recreational tool. And this is an airport example. You know, many airports do this, but Dallas Love Field Airport, I really like their interior navigation and their exterior navigation for pickups and drop-offs. So they combine some really great customer service, signage and wayfinding, customer convenience tools with geofencing and designated pickup and drop-off areas for Uber and Lyft, so they could monitor the reporting that they were getting from TNCs and also collect those fees more effectively while making things easier for riders and drivers. So we'll talk a little bit about COVID, the new normal. That's a very cliche term these days, but I wanted to show you this graphic that our curb management strategy team has created on ways that communities can start to allocate their curb in ways that adhere to new safety guidelines and help people follow those guidelines. So this shows, and a lot of these are temporary and pretty easy, you know, physical markings to delineate. So this is, you know, some spacing on the sidewalk with tape, customer pickup zones, space to maintain social distancing, buffers in certain areas to make sure that people have kind of physical reminders of you know, ways to keep their distance. You also have this temporary parklet. So this is a little gathering and socialization area for folks. So this is just a kind of visual representation of ways in which communities can start to allocate their curb to promote adherence to safety and social guidelines related to COVID. In terms of your own curb strategy in the time of COVID, you know, really understanding your system, performing operational audits, knowing where what your expenses are, maybe looking at opportunities to cut expenses, leveraging data and understanding of your key performance indicators to start to make changes to your system. Establishing a clear framework for enforcement, like when are you going to start enforcing parking again? When are you going to start to charge for parking again, for example, and communicating that effectively to your constituency. Prioritizing flexibility, prioritizing testing, so maybe piloting some things and seeing how people react and adapt. Frequent communication with constituents. Of course, following safety guidelines and procedures that are applicable in your community or in your context. Looking to vendors and consultants to help you embrace contactless solutions, or if you already have mobile payment options, for example, really leveraging that and communicating that as a prioritized option. creating additional transient options. So you can see here in this graphic that, we added this space for short-term customer pickup. If you don't have a ton of quick parking options in your community or in your context, maybe creating those temporarily. Holding firm on revenue sources. So, just because we're in this challenging time doesn't necessarily mean that you have to eradicate all ways in which you are collecting revenue. And just as long as you're communicating that effectively and you have a clear justification for why you're continuing to collect revenue, that's really important. And also collaborating, especially if you're a municipality, this is something that we're all dealing with. This is all new. This is new to all of us. So really starting to, see what others are doing, see what's worked in other cities, other campuses, other communities, and learning from that and applying that to your own context. So conclusions and key context. Again, I really want to emphasize that curb management, it has this reputation for high-tech, sexy initiatives, but it can mean many things. It can mean even just simple physical delineation of your right-of-way from private space. And really, you can do it in a lot of different contexts. There are a lot of good management strategies that can help make access to the curb more equitable, improve level of service among multiple transportation modes, help you collect data on your transportation activity and what's happening on the ground. And it can make it possible to monetize the curb or increase the revenue sources that you already have. Really starting small, engaging with constituents and choosing strategies that coincide with your broader goals and priorities, making sure that any strategy you choose is actually helping you in the path of creating the vision that you want to create in your campus or in your community environment. So these are some key contacts. This is my contact information. Andrews, who's the president of SWAPTA and the board, and I might be saying that wrong, but I think that's what he is. And he's also the director of studies in our office. And also we have Chrissy Mancini-Nichols, who is our national curb management strategy lead and has a ton of technical knowledge and experience in this area. And I'd be happy to loop her into any more technical questions that you might have. I can already see a couple that I might bring her in on and follow up with you all on using her incredible knowledge. So with that, I will open it to questions. I will stop my screen share and turn on my video.
Hi, Mallory. Hey,
Hi.
Did you see the couple of questions in the Q&A? You've got one from Donovan about
I did.
discussing approaches to monetizing, and how have you qualified your statement that sensors used in APGS do not provide adequate data? Can you talk to those two?
Sure, yeah. So I might have misspoke a bit. I mean, I think that there are ground-based sensors and other data collection, tech-based data collection options that provide effective data to communities. We have found that the sensors that are the sensor technology that is in play now is not advanced enough to fulfill the strategies with demand-based pricing that specifically municipalities are trying to achieve. So if you're trying to use ground-based sensors to, for example, monitor utilization in a specific area and then communicate appropriate pricing changes to that area, we haven't yet found a municipality that has been able to effectively do that yet. So it's just intended to say that if you're trying to look at a demand-based pricing system, you might want to start a little more elementary first before thinking about trying to use demand-based pricing to really achieve a utilization goal in your community or in your parking assets. In terms of approaches to monetizing loading zones, the most effective strategy that we've seen work so far among our municipal clients has not been a geofencing tool. It's in fact been a permit-based tool or a meter-based tool. So using technology and strategies that a lot of municipalities are actually already using. Meters are prevalent in a lot of different communities, for example. So creating meters that have options for quick parking sessions or loading sessions have been a really effective way. And also a permit system. So if you have a frequent commercial delivery company like an Amazon, a UPS, a FedEx, etc., using your loading areas in your community, having a paid permit system in order to realize some revenue from that frequent usage of your right-of-way. Thank you for those questions. And if you'd like, I can follow up specifically on the sensor based question. That was a conversation that we've had recently. We were actually just talking to a current municipal client about their desire to implement demand-based pricing, and our curb management strategy lead had a lot of great examples on why, you know, sensors are maybe not achieving the goals that municipalities want them to. That certainly isn't to say that a sensor company isn't achieving the goals that it wants to. It's just that municipalities aren't able to realize that goal as effectively as they want to with that system. Thank you.
Did you see the question in the chat box? You may have already answered it. From Alexandra about information on cities starting to assess collection or collect fees from TNC.
Yeah, so a lot of this, so there aren't that many cities that are currently collecting fees from transportation network companies. A lot of them are larger cities. And of course, most airports, you know, international airports are collecting fees. So a lot of the framework and technology that we're using or thinking about to collect fees is coming from them. So what we've seen be effective is geofencing in terms of a way to collect fees from transportation network companies. Chicago, for example, uses a geofencing within a certain area to effectively collect fees from transportation network companies that are picking up or dropping off passengers within that location. But permit systems can also work for transportation network companies to some extent, although obviously with the transient nature of folks who drive for transportation network companies and the vehicles that are coming in and out of usage in those transportation network companies, that would be much harder than say with a commercial delivery option. So geofencing is the main strategy there. In an airport context, it's really important to remember that transportation network companies might be underreporting in some cases. And so it's really important if you're in an airport environment to use your own data collection and your own tools to make sure that that reporting is actually correct and you're collecting the right amount of fees. Any other questions or topics that you wanted to discuss? We can just kind of open it up. Darby, I didn't see anything else in the questions.
I didn't either. I looked.
Yeah.
Has anybody got anything else out there to add to all of this wonderful information? Doesn't look like it.
Okay, well, I think we got some really good questions. And again, you know, if I definitely acknowledge that I am certainly not the absolute owner of all of this information at our firm. There are other people at our firm who have much more technical knowledge about curb management. This is intended to be a high-level overview. And if you have any other more technical questions, I will be happy to direct them to our national strategy lead, who has just a ton of in-person and direct experience with implementing these strategies in communities throughout the country.
Awesome. Thank you, Mallory. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Y'all have a good week. Socially distanced, stay safe, all that fun stuff.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.